Okay, let's get started. Welcome here. My name is Peter Feaver, and I'm a professor of political science and public policy. And I have the honor of hosting the Egan Visiting Professor for 2022, which is David French, and I'll introduce him in a moment. While I have you captive, I want to advertise a couple of talks that are coming up. We're having a number of in-person talks, which is great. That may catch your interest. Next Tuesday, a talk on the Cold War from the margins of book discussion. And then next Thursday, we're having Mike Abramowitz, who is the head of Freedom House, and he will be here in person. The week after that, Phil Richardson is coming, and he's one of the assistant directors for national intelligence. And then on next week, Wednesday, we will have Jean Lee, who is an expert on North Korea, which is one of the other pots that are bubbling on the back burner of President Biden. And might boil over at any time. But you all came to hear the Egan Visiting Professor. Let me tell you about the Egan program. This is a gift to do to bring public intellectuals whose voices are interesting and important in the national scene, but maybe a perspective that isn't already in abundant supply at Duke and other speaker series. So we're going for oddball distinctives, and David. Maybe you'll fill the bill, we'll see. David French is a very prominent public commentator. He has 267 Twitter followers. No, that's 267,000 Twitter followers.
I'm not sure that's a good thing.
He founded a new magazine or a media outlet, what you would call it on Dispatch, that has some of the most interesting commentary across the full range of society, politics, culture, religion. I think you have a cooking show on Hulu Plus or something. I don't know. You're everywhere. But you're here at Duke, so welcome to Duke.
Well, thank you. And I am the most famous pundit advocate of Aquaman.
So, there's so much happening, but I almost want to ask you about Tom Brady first, just as we get off the site. I know
I have thoughts.
I know you do have thoughts, but I'm not going to ask you about Tom Brady. I do want us to talk about national security in the Republican Party. Maybe just flag one or two things in your bio that would be of interest that help shape your thinking as you think about Republicans and national security.
Yeah, so I grew up, I'm a kid of the Cold War. So I'm born in 1969. I come of age really at one of the hottest points of the Cold War. So just to describe to you the level of nerdery you're dealing with. I was the kind of kid who went to high school, not junior high school, with a Dungeons and Dragons player module, player handbook in one hand, and a coffee table book analyzing the balance of forces between NATO and the Warsaw Pact in the other.
So your evenings weren't taken up dating and things like
that. I was consistently amazed that wasn't the case. And so I grew up a kid of the Cold War. My parents were at the time governed Democrats, and in my your childhood act of rebellion, I found myself drawn to sort of the Reagan Republican point of view, especially on the Cold War, and especially it was, in my young life, I was much more drawn to his perspective on the Cold War, and always had an interest in foreign policy, always had an interest in particular in great power rivalry. Then years into my legal career, I had supported the war in Iraq, and my glasses are fogging up, so I just see blobs now, but that's fine. So years into, I had supported the Iraq War, and then in 2005, I started to feel convicted that here I was a little old at the time, like 36, but I was very, I was healthy, able-bodied, and I supported this war, but I wasn't doing one thing about it. So I persuaded my wife to let me walk down to the recruiting office in Center City, Philly, and walked into the office. And just to set the stage, I was not the chiseled physique that you see before you today. I I was about 25 pounds heavier, just as bald, and walked in and I said, hey, I'm a lawyer. I would like to join the Army. Can I get an age waiver? They had no idea what to do. No idea. So they sent me to get a physical, which I barely passed. And I only passed because it was 2005 and they were mainly checking pulses at that point. But to make a long story short, I joined the Army, joined the Army Reserve, went to Officer Basic in 2006, deployed to Iraq with the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment in 2007, was there from 07 to 08, came back, was in the reserves for 8 years, also served in South Korea. In my civilian life, I began to take on a kind of an additional sort of area of expertise in the law of armed conflict and international law, and was part of a legal team that represented the interests of the government of Israel before the International Criminal Court, responding to allegations of Israeli war crimes during the main Gaza incursion in 2008. So really dove into national security, international law of armed conflict, and never really dove out of it. So that's kind of the background.
So what about the Republicans? Will you fess up to being a Republican?
No, I'm a former Republican. I stopped being a Republican in 2016. The short story reason for that is my Republicanism always depended on an understanding that, particularly if you're going to be a conservative, which in my view meant devolving responsibility down to away from the federal government and much more to localities and individuals, that won't work at all without a high premium placed on individual character. And so a party that would promote somebody and endorse somebody of that character, of Trump, I couldn't be a part of. I understand people of goodwill can disagree on that, but that's where my conscience led me. But before then, oh my gosh, was I a Republican. I was a Romney delegate at the RNC in 2012. Gosh, I went back and have you ever done this when you've moved? Maybe you're not old enough to be nostalgic yet, but someday you're going to be old enough that when you're going to move, you're going to come across your high school yearbook and you're going to see what your classmates said about you. And you're either going to feel pride or a pang of regret. And for me, it was a pang of regret because before anything else that they said about me, like, oh, you're such a kind person, or you're a good person, or, you're an athletic powerhouse. No, that was never.
Dungeons and Dragons.
You're the best dungeon master I ever had. They said, man, I really hope you have a future Republican. Gosh, that's not the legacy you want. So I was very much a Republican, very much a partisan Republican. But the interesting thing for me, my personal journey, is that when I deployed to Iraq in 07-08, I was with, as I said earlier, I was with the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment. And I was deployed, and they took normally the JAG officers are kind of in the headquarters unit at regimental headquarters, but this time the regimental commander wanted one JAG officer with each one of the cavalry squadrons, in other words, the line units. So I was with Sabre Squadron, 2nd Squadron in Eastern Diyala, and we had a really tough deployment. It was a really tough deployment. We had almost 800 guys that we deployed with, and our total casualties combined killed and wounded was almost 100. It was a tough deployment. And one of the things I saw up close was the Sunni Shia civil war. So we were just smack in the middle. And what I saw there kind of began to shock me out of partisanship. And so I came home having seen sort of this extreme version of what it looks like when there's deep-seated grievance and animosity. And this is the thing that was really important about my understanding of the Sunni Shia civil war. It wasn't an ideological war. Yeah, Sunni and Shia have differences in theology, okay? They had differences politically, profound differences. How are you going to split up the oil revenues? What's going to be representation in the Iraqi government? What is going to be the composition of the armed forces, the police forces? All of these things had real consequence, but what really motivated people was the deep grievance. The Sunni killed my cousin, the Shia killed my nephew. And what I began to see when I came home was, although we had ideological disagreements between right and left in the US, US. And while we had disagreements on matters of real consequence, on things from tax policy to foreign policy, what was building was that sense of grievance between right and left, that a sense of moral injury inflicted by one side against the other. Thankfully, not to the level of violence that we saw there, but sort of different, similar in kind, if not in degree. And so I became much more interested and focused on rejecting partisanship as a frame of mind or an identity, much more interested in polarization as a phenomenon in the US. And so I feel like I spent a lot of the last several years sort of zigging away from partisanship and polarization at the same time that much of America was zagging right and straight towards it.
But it obviously wasn't immediate because you come back and then you're a Romney delegate, so you.
Oh yeah, but it's funny, you look back on Mitt Romney now, and you're not saying, oh man, David, you were really polarized supporting that monster Mitt Romney. No, like you look back on supporting Mitt Romney now, and when you fast forward a few years and he becomes the first senator in the whole history of the entire United States to vote to convict a president from their own party, and you realize that that's not a man who is defined by partisanship.
No. Okay, so let me ask the question, is it even worth talking about Republicans and national security? They're out of power, this doesn't matter. Why would this matter? Why would this topic matter?
Oh man, this topic matters a ton, because when you have a two-party system in a very closely divided country, it's just a kind of folly to think that one side or the other is going to obtain a dominant position for the indefinite future. So, what's one of the reasons why I think people should want two healthy parties? And there's this sort of short-sighted view that we sometimes see when people are purely dedicated to partisanship, where they kind of rub their hands together and they say, ha ha, you nominated a crazy, now I'm gonna beat you. Well, you don't always do that. And then sometimes you end up with the person that you were happy to see nominated now is a member of Congress, is a member of the Senate, maybe in the White House. And so when you have two parties closely divided, the point of view of both parties matter. It just matters a great deal to the health of the nation. And the more unhealthy one party is, or both parties are, but the more unhealthy one party is, the more risky, the more risk that accrues to your country, whether it's the economy, international relations, your culture, et cetera.
So Republicans for decades had what political scientists call issue ownership on national security.
Yeah.
So the argument was when national security was the topic, Republicans had the advantage at the presidential level.
Yeah.
And that when domestic policy was the focus, that played to Democrat strengths. What do you think President Trump did to that traditional story that I just told?
Yeah, that's a good question. And just sort of as evidence for that traditional story, I mean, in 1979, early 1980, a sort of point of view about Jimmy Carter locked in about weakness in the face of the Soviet threat. And the Democrats didn't win the White House again until the Cold War was over. That's how sort of profound. Now, I'm not going to say that was the only issue. The economy was at stake, but Democrats didn't win the White House again until the Cold War was over. The only Republican popular vote victory since George H.W. Bush in 1992 was what? George W. Bush in 2004 after 9/11. So there is a lot of evidence for sort of a traditional Republican issue lock on that. What Trump did basically was it's really hard. Here's my perspective on Trump and foreign policy. If you're going to list the reasons why Trump defeated the GOP establishment, foreign policy was way down the list. The big change was not that Trump won the argument on foreign. This is my view. I mean, we have all kinds. We're going to be arguing for 50 years about all the factors that led to Trump's rise. The big change in my view was that Trump's relative isolationism wasn't disqualified. That when he directly went after George W. Bush on the Iraq War, that wasn't disqualified. When he sort of adopted the language of endless wars, that wasn't disqualified. that foreign policy in the Republican electorate had receded to such a point in importance that that kind of rhetoric, his level of isolationism, which again was completely contradictory to decades of Republican foreign policy, wasn't disqualified. So to me, that was the fundamental change.
But just to be precise here, you're saying it wasn't disqualifying, it wasn't particularly appealing necessarily.
It wasn't necessarily, it was so far,
It wasn't a big negative like it would have been in a different.
yeah, it was so far down the line. And some of the evidence for this is some of the loudest cheers for Trump early in his presidency came when Allied forces finally retook Mosul, or finally drove ISIS as a caliphate out of Iraq, or took Raqqa in Syria, or when he dropped the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan. This sort of very this real pride in sort of Trump's the aggressive part of his foreign policy early in his presidency was much more sort of consistent with that more muscular Republican consensus. But other things had become so much more important to the Republican primary voter that heterodoxy on foreign policy, just to the extent it was on their minds, it was just kind of out of reflexive loyalty to Trump, that they would say, yeah, we should end the war in Afghanistan. We should, that was much more out of reflexive loyalty to Trump than the victory of the Buchananite wing of the GOP.
Are you now talking about 2016, or do you see a change in the Republican voter over the 4 years of Trump's presidency? So, for instance, the act of defending him over and over again convinces yourself that maybe he's right on this issue.
I have not seen a change in your rank and file, like your average Republican voter. I have seen a change in your MAGA voter. And so I live, just as some background, I live in a very red part of Tennessee. I really recommend, if you want to sort of figure out our various bubbles and cocoons that we live in, there's a New York Times neighborhood calculator where you can put in your address and you can find out what percentage of your neighborhood is Republican or Democrat. So I'm in a very diverse political neighborhood. Only 85% of my neighbors are Republican. And I have this real habit of, I only live in a deep blue or a deep red place. Like I never can find this sort of that golden mean. But so anyway, there's a real division. There's sort of the person who was Republican for 25, 30 years before Trump goes along, and after Trump's gone, they're still going to be Republican. And that person isn't really fundamentally different. The way they bonded with Trump was through Trump's opposition to this kind of traditional Republican ways, opposition to the media, trying to get Hillary out, keep Hillary out, prevent Biden from coming in. But there's another class of people who really sort of were vacuumed into the Republican Party because of Trump. And there you see a much more sort of skeptical view towards NATO, for example, a skeptical view towards international alliances more broadly, against foreign deployments more broadly, this sort of America First rhetoric, that you'll see much more, but it's not unanimous. But I will also say in the sort of the intellectual class, the GOP intellectual class, there's a much stronger strain. And I keep using the term isolationism or America First, but it's all of a substitute for saying profound skepticism to forward deployments, profound skepticism about American military alliances. All of this is, not the GOP I grew up with.
So I'm going to pull on that thread in a moment, but first I want to go back to the issue of feeling obliged to defend Trump. Not you, but Republicans in the national security space. So Republicans were always more hawkish on Putin and lambasted Obama for playing footsie with the reset and so forth with the Russians on the one hand, and also were pretty hawkish on North Korea.
Yeah.
And you get a lot of hawkish rhetoric from the Trump administration on Russia, but not from Trump himself.
Right.
On North Korea, you get lots of hawkish rhetoric from the president himself up until
the change,
Yes.
and then it's like he's Kim Jong-un he's my bro.
Right, so, but here's my question. Why didn't the president lose those Republicans once you see him, embracing Kim Jong-un, for instance, or some of the more cringy things that were said about Putin, by the president?
Because again, the foreign policy priority was down here. The priority of beating the media and beating the Democrats was way up here. So if you allow yourself to be if you allow there to be any daylight between you and Trump for the lesser priority, you're harming the greater priority. And so this sort of sends, and you could see it all in Red America, was you have to rally behind Trump because of the greater issue. So, and then also you have this incredible pressure from the Trump administration, loyalty. They're extremely sensitive to critique, even minor critique. So you have from the top down, you have to rally. From the grassroots up, you have to rally. And so if your issue number one is, I don't want Hillary Clinton to be president, or I really despise the mainstream media, or Pelosi and Schumer and all of it, that's issue one. And issue 19 is North Korea. Why would you talk about North Korea? And so that's one of the, an interesting sort of aspect of foreign policy.
The president's talking about it.
Well, the president's talking about it, but you're not going to let something that you care about a whole lot less than these other things to drive a wedge between you and the president.
I have a different theory, which is that the key move in this story is the Russia collusion charge. And that once Trump Republicans decided they had to defend the president on that, they started to evolve their position on Russia.
That's specific to Russia. So we were talking about North Korea, yeah. So the Russia narrative is a different thing, because then that's when we're going to get into sort of the actual affirmative pro-Russia rhetoric that you often hear on the right. There's a different. The Russia thing is its own thing in some ways. And so, that's an issue that's rooted in a combination of factors. So one is you go completely, it is really pretty stunning going from in 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, there's this sense of profound sort of moral outrage at the Obama administration and the way that they were so snarky at Mitt Romney. Remember the 80s call, they want their foreign policy back. Well, it turns out the 80s may not have called, they might have texted. Like there was, we're getting some stuff coming, it's not exact parallel, but we're in a different situation than we hope to be right now. So there's this sense of profound anger and this sort of sense of moral injury and anger on behalf of Mitt. You were right, Mitt. You were right. They were wrong. So then 2016 rolls around and several things happen at once. Number one, wait a minute, is there evidence that Russia is interfering because they're more afraid of Hillary than Trump? Well, that alone created enormous cognitive dissonance. The very idea that the Russians would be more alarmed by a Democratic president than a Republican president was like, does not compute. What are you talking about? Well, then you begin to get this evidence of weirdness between Trump and Russia. Eventually we learn a lot of things like that Trump Jr. and Manafort and Jared Kushner met with a Russian lawyer. We know that there was a letter of intent about Trump Tower Moscow. We learn about all of the things we eventually learned about. But there's just this weirdness around Russia, and there's still the imperative of beating Hillary. So you kind of have to push that away. Then the Mueller investigation becomes the central threat to Trump's presidency. And then it became sort of in right-wing media circles, a way of mocking the obsession with Russia as a way of mocking Trump's opponents. Russia, Russia, Russia. So if you had any concern about Trump's contacts with Russia, regardless of whether you believed the full-on Steele dossier nonsense, but if you had any concern, you were called a Russia hoaxer. And so the whole idea of a Russian threat was denigrated as part of the effort to build up Trump. And then here's where it gets a little spooky, okay? Here's where it gets a little spooky. A segment of the right began to see Vladimir Putin as a defender of Christian values against the godless woke West.
He looked into his soul and saw like what they said.
Yeah, apparently. So a number of people began to see Vladimir Putin as, and there's this really interesting, and Putin was pretty shrewd about the way he began to sort of play up his ties, Russia's ties to the Orthodox Church, scorning of Western weakness, which is like music to the ears of certain sort of like new right Twitter pugilists. And so he began to really sort of cast himself as this defender of Orthodox Christian values against, the progressive EU, the woke US. And so that, began to shift in some people's minds, sort of the balance of the equities, so to speak. So where now you have rhetoric out of the #1 rated talk show host on TV that all NATO exists only to annoy Vladimir Putin. And there's sort of this idea that, well, darn it, we don't really want the Russian army to invade Ukraine. I mean, who really wants that? But if Ukraine's got to go, it's got to go, and which is a really interesting turn, and how it's an interesting way of how a foreign opponent can play on the dysfunctions of our domestic political culture to generate unmerited sympathy for his authoritarian cause.
So I have what I think is a friendly amendment to that.
Okay.
Is that the other move in that way, just I'm thinking of my friends who are ardent Trump supporters, the other move that they make is to say, it was a hoax. It was the Steele dossier which was all made up and was dirty tricks from the Clinton people, is the sum total of it. And therefore, I don't have to deal with cognitive dissonance because it's all a campaign trick from Hillary's people. And therefore, then the rest of it follows. So once you make that first move, then the rest of it follows. And anytime you're losing argument over here, you go back to the first move and say it was all the Steele dossier from the beginning.
Yeah, one of the reasons I wrote an article, a couple of years ago. All time is just blurring at this point. And a couple of years ago, I was still at National Review, where I said the Steele dossier is one of the most malignant documents created in the modern history of American politics for two reasons. Reason number, well, for one reason, it plays out in two ways. The reason is it created a narrative of what the Russia scandal was. And so for some folks on the left, not everybody, but for some folks on the left, the purpose of the Mueller investigation was to prove up the Steele dossier. And for some folks on the right, that meant if the Steele dossier wasn't proven, there was nothing bad going on. When the reality is, if you could just go back in time and hoover up the Steele dossier out of the narrative and put it to the side, the objective facts that have been established both by the Mueller investigation and the Senate Intelligence Committee report, which was a Republican committee at the time, are objectively upsetting and disturbing. And across red America, people will not hear those facts. I cannot tell you how many times I have raised the objectively documented facts of both Mueller and the Senate Intelligence Committee, which have not been rebutted. Right. And have been called a hoaxer.
Yeah. So the people, though, let's go back to the Putin fascination because it just seems so timely. Mm-hmm. The people who are exhibiting that are quite sophisticated Americans. They're the most sophisticated and powerful voice in Fox News tonight. Now is
powerful. I'm not sure about sophisticated.
Okay, well, Tucker Carlson is no slouch. He wrote for a Weekly Standard. He has serious backstory. He's unlike there's some others, who are more easy to dismiss as.
He's no Seb Gorka, in other words.
Okay, I didn't say the name, but but take Tucker Carlson. He's also of tremendous influence.
Oh yeah.
So he is making claims about Putin and Ukraine that are disturbing to the story you're telling. So can you explain why Tucker is doing it?
No, I think Tucker's doing it because I think Tucker's doing it because that he's bought into almost all of the narrative I just said. That the Russia hoax was a hoax. It was mainly a bad faith attempt to go get the president. The president has been subject to unfair persecution surrounding Russia from day one. I think he's bought into the narrative that Vladimir Putin, that the people he dislikes in the West, sort of the globalist class and Democrats and those who are more traditional Reagan Republicans, all don't like Putin. In our negative partisanship, that means I'm going to be suddenly tempted to like Putin. And so I think, and then he's bought into the sort of this idea of Russia as a traditionalist society with its own sphere of influence, that it is entitled to dominate, that the expansion of NATO was an unwise expansion into that Russian traditional sphere. It was aggressive. It should be perceived by Russia as aggressive rather than defensive. So I think he's bought into all that whole narrative, at least if you listen to his words, he has, yeah.
So I have a different theory, or a complementary theory. Tell me whether this would work. If you can get wealthy without appealing to all the Republicans, then one can do what Tucker Carlson is doing or the narrowcasters are doing. But that the Republicans more broadly, those who want to get elected, nominated by the party as a whole, and then want to win president, they are not following Carlson down this path. So the people who are following him are House members for the most part. But those who in the Senate who want to be presidents, Cruz, Cotton, Hawley, they're more hawkish on Putin than Carlson is. And even former President Trump has not echoed this line, at least I haven't heard it yet.
Well, Carlson is not the spokesperson of the GOP. I mean, he's a spokesperson for a faction.
Okay.
Now, Carlson is spokesperson for a powerful enough faction to get Ted Cruz to grovel.
Yes.
But it doesn't take a lot to do that. So yeah, I mean, he's part of a faction. You know, that's one of the things that if you're looking from the outside in at the GOP, it looks a lot more united than it is. Mm-hmm. And you know, believe me, when people are much more ambivalent about Trump than they will tell pollsters, there's sort of a rally around the flag aspect in the face of, oh, here's somebody on the left who's trying to get me to say something about Trump. No, people are more ambivalent about a lot of things. The fact of the matter is, what Republicanism means as a matter of policy is completely up in the air right now. It's up in the air when it comes to big government versus limited government. It's up in the air when it comes to the First Amendment, even, which is something I never thought that I would see. It's up in the air when it comes to foreign policy. It is up in the air. And Carlson is one voice. He's one voice. He happens to be a very loud voice. He happens to be a voice that is very inflammatory, therefore collects a disproportionate amount of Twitter attention, which then means anything that gets disproportionate Twitter attention gets disproportionate journalist attention, because that's where we all are. So he's just a voice. He is not the party. Although I think, you know, it's certainly in his interest to sort of cast himself as the future of the party.
So do you think would your answers be the same if we shifted from Putin to December 6th and
January 6th.
Sorry, January 6th and the attack on the Capitol and the whole, was that an insurrection or not? Is it the same logic that explains why Tucker Carlson is doing what he did on
There's a faction of the Republican Party that is whatever, quote unquote, the narrative is. So if there's a narrative that I must dislike Putin, I'm rethinking Putin. If there's a narrative that January 6th was a violent attack on our Constitution, well, I'm going to rethink January 6th. If there's a narrative that the vaccines are safe and effective, I'm going to rethink the vaccine. You just see this as a constant in a particular faction of the GOP. And Tucker is probably the foremost avatar of that, but there are many other voices like that. So that's where you're going to see a super high degree of overlap
between somebody who thinks the election is stolen and somebody who wouldn't wear a mask in June of 2020 and who won't take the vaccine in June of 2021 and has strange new respect for Vladimir Putin in February of 2022. There's an enormous amount of overlap because a lot of this is a cultural response, not a manifestation of a comprehensive ideology or theory of foreign policy or public health or American electoral law. And this might come as some surprise to you guys. But it is a cultural pose driven by negative polarization. And so if you guys don't know what negative polarization is, it's the central, most important way of understanding our current political landscape. And what negative polarization says is that I support my side, not so much because I love its ideas or its ideology or its people, but because I hate or fear the other side. And so the ultimate manifestation, and we've heard the phrase trigger the libs or own the libs, that's negative partisanship. Or people who are happy if you're unhappy, that's negative partisanship. So if your drive is towards that negative partisanship, you're going to start to become a full spectrum contrarian against whatever your opponents tend to believe. And that will pull together all kinds of things that are nonsensical. But once you're able to see through that prism, oh, okay, it makes sense. This is negative partisanship. This isn't a theory of foreign policy.
And why do you suppose this is especially true of your home tribe, our home tribe, where's mine, evangelicals? People who used to be called evangelicals used to therefore be part of the loyal base. When President Bush would talk about it, he says, I'm down to two factions, the Christians and the army. That's what I'm left with.
That's all he's got left.
And then he'd say, but that was the same for Lincoln. So that's sort of how he felt about himself. But everything you said applies a fortiori to the evangelicals.
Yeah. So, man, okay. So do we have another 2 hours? So when you use the term evangelical, we have to define our terms. And in the context of politics, the cohort of people who are called white evangelicals are defined by exit polls. Okay, so they're not defined by a theological test at all. They're defined by exit polls. When you walk out of a polling booth, someone's going to ask you a series of questions about your demographics. And one of the questions are going to be, are you a white evangelical? Are you white? Yep. Are you evangelical or born again? Yes. And so if you answer yes to that, then you're an evangelical. Doesn't matter what you actually believe, okay? And so over time, what has happened is that an enormous number of people who are white Christians, who identify as Christians, have come to identify themselves as evangelicals because that is part of a core element of the GOP. And it's a core element. So in many ways, white evangelicalism in the exit polling sense has become kind of a God and country lifestyle argument. Okay. Now, if you're going to go and you're going to talk about, are you an evangelical? Well, what's an evangelical? Well, there's this test of theological test. And across all demographics in America, only about 7% of Americans meet that test. Whereas in the exit poll question, white evangelicals alone are 28% of the electorate, okay? So if you go with the 7% of all ethnicities, it is not monolithically Republican at all. If you go with that 7% of all ethnicities, it's more Republican than Democrat, but it's not Republican. It's not overwhelmingly at all. But what's happened is this 28%, this God and country lifestyle blank brand, is highly geographically concentrated and is now fallen prey to a very human phenomenon. And this is what Kat Sunstein called the law of group polarization. So what is the law of group polarization? It's when people of like mind gather, they tend to become,
You may have lost you, so
the law of handheld mics. Yes. that the batteries, they have the shortest battery life of any electronic. Okay, so the law of group polarization is that when like-minded people gather, they tend to become more extreme. So if you get together 6 people and you are absolutely convinced that, let's just say you get together 6 people and you're gun rights advocates, and you're all gun rights advocates, that at the end of your conversation, you're going to be more committed to your point of view. This is just, and we see it right and left. This is a human condition.
We also see it in Cameron Indoor Stadium.
Yes, it's the paradigm. Yeah. And so what's happened is this community has just become more and more and more, in many ways, just radicalized politically, to where we've seen things that I never thought that I would see. And a lot of this is the natural human consequences of, one, identifying yourself primarily through a political lens as opposed to religious lens, and number 2, therefore being hyper concentrated in like-minded communities. And so when that happens, extremism follows like night follows day. And this is not, guys, just a right-wing phenomenon. There is a lot of evidence that there has been a dramatic increase in sort of radicalism on the left side of the spectrum as well. I mean, there are entire cities in the US that are less politically diverse than your average evangelical megachurch. Truthful. I mean, the city of San Francisco, the city of New York, aside from Staten Island. I mean, they're entire massive communities. And that creates extremism. And so what ends up beginning to happen is that we then begin to have a country of a lot of competing extremisms. And that's one of the things that's responsible for our incredibly divisive and toxic discourse right now.
Now, a lot of this, for the benefit of the audience, comes from your best-selling book, Divided We Fall. Right?
Best-selling's generous.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well said.
I'm fine with it.
Okay. In academic circles, that's a huge seller. And you wrote that in the summer of 2020 or so.
Yeah, so finished it in summer of 2020.
Okay, so fast forward to winter of 2022, are we further down the path that you warned about then? Or
Unquestionably.
So what's that in itself is a national security threat?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, it's one of the reasons I think why we're seeing the buildup on the border of Ukraine right now. I think it's one of the reasons why we see large-scale Chinese incursions.
Make the connection.
So, and you see this throughout history. This is not exceptional to this time, but dictators who are trying to achieve aggressive goals will often exploit what they perceive to be divisions, especially in Western democracies. I mean, this is something that has happened before. Gosh, I don't want to go all 1938 on us, but let's go 1914 instead. Perceived divisions and distractions in democratic countries are often seen as an invitation to aggression. And so what we have here in this country is an enormous amount of division and distraction. Vladimir Putin knows that there is zero, and I mean zero, will in the United States of America to risk American lives for Ukraine. His only question is how much will is there for America to exert really much or any of its economic strength, or how much will is there for America to send sufficient arms to Ukraine to make the Russian incursion or invasion too costly for Russia. So this is a very common phenomenon. You're not living in unique times when it comes to the perception of division. If you go, gosh, I'm doing it, I'm going all 1938. Roosevelt in the run-up to World War II was just not a consequential player, really. Why? Domestic politics didn't permit him to be. They didn't permit him to be. So here you are, you're looking at Britain and France and Russia as the foremost players in the run-up, when the United States of America, already at that time, a mighty economy, even during the Depression and had demonstrated itself in World War I to be capable of mass mobilization. I mean, we forget sort of the size, the ultimate size of the American commitment in World War I. I mean, the Battle of Meuse-Argonne Forest is still maybe perhaps the largest land battle in the history of the U.S. Army. And so this idea that a United States, a country of enormous potential power, can be effectively neutralized by its own internal divisions is not a new concept in geopolitics.
So, do you see a Republican voice that would lead the Republican Party out of what you consider to be dangerous waters? Is there a Moses?
Where is Moses? No.
Nikki Haley?
No, oh, come on. No.
Governor DeSantis?
You're just triggering me. No, let me.
Senator Hall?
Oh, stop, please. Okay, no, I'm being a little facetious. Let me put it this way. Right now, Trump is still the dominant figure. We're in an environment where, imagine it's 1978, and Richard Nixon is still dominating the Republican Party. Could Reagan thrive in that environment? Maybe, I don't know. What's happened is the Republican Party has had a president that it should have let go of, that much of it, including the grassroots, is still wrapping both arms around. And so that's choking out the ability of other people to step forward. Could Nikki Haley, in theory, step forward and be a different voice? There were moments, even during the Trump administration, where she seemed to kind of defy the president, if you remember. But she can't right now in my view, seem to decide who she is, which is a poor preview for leadership on the global stage. DeSantis is really casting his lot with the more populist right in a way that I don't necessarily think is authentic to who he is, but he's really all in on that sort of very online Twitter, riling the Twitter masses. Well, like, you can't really use the term masses and Twitter in the same, the Twitter microcultures. But are there impressive foreign policy minds in the Republican Party? Sure there are. Is it easy for them to get an independent voice right now? It is very difficult. So even though I pay a lot of attention to that, I can't tell you off the top of my head who an heir apparent is. We have to wait for somebody to actually step forward and say, I am coming at the king.
Well, obviously, this is presuming that former President Trump is still alive. If he were not on the stage for some natural causeless reason, it would be a free-for-all.
A total free-for-all.
But in that space, I think you would see a hawkish voice coming from someone like Secretary Pompeo.
Or Tom Cotton.
Well, he's already out there with that.
Yeah.
But I'm saying Pompeo has kept his powder dry on this issue in the last 6 months. He's been losing weight, but not speaking loudly on foreign policy yet. But I'm wondering whether he would be the one.
The difficulty, he's Trump's Secretary of State. He was the guy who put in place the Trump more America first foreign policy, which was never as America first and never as isolationist as Trump's rhetoric would imply. You always got the feeling that Trump would want one thing and then he'd be talked down. It wouldn't quite go where he wanted. Then he'd want something else and then he'd be talked down. And so if Pompeo sort of comes out and says, I was the architect of all the best,
Right.
and it was Trump's fault for all the worst. Well, that's a bad pitch in the GOP, but there is room for a more muscular foreign policy. But I'll say this, I think the room mainly is with China and not as much with Russia. There's a lot of consensus in the GOP that China is a bad actor. And that goes with the populist right on trade and the more traditional conservative movement the traditional conservative movement has never been warm to the People's Republic of China
Right.
and the Chinese Communist Party, and has always been pretty stalwart in supporting Taiwan.
But Biden has been mostly consistent with that policy on China as well. I mean, he has been fairly hawkish. It's
Yeah.
been more Kurt Campbell than Senator Kerry when it comes to China, more of the hawkish side of his administration than the dovish
So
side.
maintaining strategic ambiguity,
Quad.
yeah, I mean, and this is a big thing. One of the real deficiencies that we have, quite frankly, when we talk about foreign policy, is very few people know anything about military power. Very few people know anything about what's the difference between a Generation 4 fighter aircraft and a Generation 5. Why does that matter? What's the significance of the Australian nuclear submarine deal from a purely military perspective? From a purely military perspective, that was a giant potential over time level up for the Australian Navy that can actually impact sort of the balance of power in that part of the Pacific. And so these, purely military equations, they start to really matter. How bad is it for Ukraine that they just have several dozen Soviet era fighters right now? How much better position would they be in if they had 100 F-16s? Those kinds of things start to really matter at some point. And I do think that submarine deal with Australia, as much as it ticked off the French, which is still a bug, not a feature, as much as it ticked off the French, was really I thought a strategically shrewd move.
It also ticked off the US Navy, but that's an issue for another day. Okay, I can ask my last question, then while you're answering it, I'll collect hands from the audience. So I want you to put on, you have several hats, one of them is a former JAG, so put on your JAG hat and put on your religious freedom First Amendment expert hat.
Oh gosh, I know where this is going.
And I'm gonna ask you about one of the more interesting voices claiming religious freedom. Military members claiming they have a religious exemption to getting the vaccine. So as a JAG, as a First Amendment lawyer, do they have a case? And while you're answering that, I'll look.
Well, there's two questions over whether they have a case under current, with the current Supreme Court, or should they have a case? So should they have a case? That's a big note on that one, is my view. So I remember before I went to Iraq, we got on a bus. I'm in Fort Benning, and we get out of where are we going? Health center. What are we doing? Vaccinations. So we got off the bus and we just got in the line, and they nailed us with about every vaccination under the sun, including I don't know if any of y'all have had the anthrax vaccination. That thing hurts. I am telling you, I've seen grown men cry after the anthrax vaccination. I had the smallpox vaccination, even though I was vaccinated as a child. It's the last case of smallpox that we had. In fact, my smallpox vaccination got so infected, I almost wanted to write a memoir called Me and My Smallpox Sore, Go to Iraq. But we got vaccinated. That's what you did. The idea that I had a religious objection to that, and that was a coherent point of view within the military, was just alien to us. Now, the way the law works is that if on the absolute apex test that is applied to a religious claim is this, it's called strict scrutiny. So strict scrutiny applies under the law if the government is perceived to have treated religion any differently. In other words, if a law is perceived to target religion either in intention or effect in any concrete way. In other words, that the law is not neutral, it treats religion worse, then strict scrutiny will be applied. Now, what is strict scrutiny? Strict scrutiny says that a government action undertaken to be lawful in the face of strict scrutiny has to be in furtherance of a compelling governmental interest pursued through the least restrictive means. That's the test. So does vaccination of military forces against a disease that, even if it can't kill a soldier, can incapacitate a soldier for a period of time, does that meet a compelling governmental interest test? Easily. So the question is this going to be deemed to be the least restrictive means? Now, in that circumstance, here's where the deference to military judgment tends to come in. The justices are not experts in military tactics, strategy, or the necessity of maintaining unit cohesion in an infantry platoon. So they're generally going to defer to military experts who say, well, wait a minute, even if COVID is not typically fatal for a 25-year-old platoon leader or a 31-year-old first sergeant, there is a huge difference between somebody out for 2 to 3 days or not out at all versus out for 1 week or 2 weeks because they have, without the vaccination, they have more difficulty recovering from COVID. That can be a difference in unit cohesion, that can be a difference in unit effectiveness. And so in those circumstances, my belief is the court should and probably would say, in this circumstance, the vaccine mandate passes constitutional scrutiny, which is not to say that it would in other circumstances in the civilian world, although it will in other circumstances in the civilian world. So I feel like, I'll just give you a great example. When I was in Iraq, about how non-fatal illness can impair combat power. When I was in Iraq, again, we're in the far eastern side of Diyala province in a really small combat outpost. And a stomach bug / flu roared through the ranks. It was ugly, y'all. It was bad. And at one point, we had more than 100 soldiers incapacitated by illness at one time. Well, what does that do? That means you can't, instead of 5 patrols, maybe you're doing 4, maybe you're doing 3. Maybe it means you're postponing a mission. Maybe that actually impairs combat power. That can be a life or death matter. And so my general view on the vaccine, the religious exemptions and the vaccine mandates in the military, and also remember, most military circumstances, people are in very close quarters for extended periods of time in places where hygiene is difficult to come by. My general view is that the court will and should say that a religious exemption is not required. Now, the military can choose to grant one, of course it can, but that it's not required. In other circumstances, I think a religious exemption not only can win, but should win, but not in that circumstance.
All right, we'll see, though. You can foreign shop your way to a friendly judgment.
Well, you can't, and ultimately you've got the Supreme Court.
Yeah, we'll see. Okay.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for speaking with us tonight. You were talking about with Professor Feaver about the Republican Party finding a Moses to lead them out away from Trump. And I was wondering, why do you think Trump was able to maintain his hold? Did he beat everyone else to the chase, or did no one else come in time? And was it that was it that the grassroots were what he maintained and therefore the elite stayed, or the elite stayed and therefore the grassroots stayed?
Well, that's a really good question. I've got my own theory, again, with the caveat that we're going to be debating this 50 years from now. But here's my basic theory, and that is Trump grabbed a core constituency early that wasn't going to leave him. And so he had a higher floor than almost anybody else. Then he has a multi-candidate race where basically everyone involved couldn't believe that he was going to be the guy. And so they didn't go right after. If you remember, millions and millions of dollars before New Hampshire were spent attacking the threat to the Republic named Marco Rubio, which in hindsight just seems incredible that was the case, just incredible. Here's Rubio, who is absolutely a conventional Republican politician, a person who at the time was sort of seen almost Reagan-esque in his potential, and people are just trying to demolish it. And Donald Trump's just sailing along. And so everyone kept waiting for Trump to implode, but what they didn't see was the thing that made him an incredible candidate to them made him an attractive candidate to his base. And so there was a lot of denial and a lot of division. And so people kept hanging in the race longer than they normally would because they thought, I don't want to be the sucker that leaves this race before the Trump implosion. And so by the time it's pretty much over, Trump had locked up the nomination with less than 40% of the primary vote. He got a lower percentage of the primary vote since the advent of the open primary system in the Republican Party. So then you fast forward till November 2016, and I can tell you this, there are a couple of things going on at once. One was this incredible groundswell of the MAGA base. And then a whole nother group of people that the best way to describe them was on the one hand, they're going, go Trump in public. And in private, you can imagine them, they're just sharpening their knives at home because they're waiting for Trump to lose. They're going to knife all the MAGA people. They're going to say, we did this, it failed, now listen to me, right? Okay, so that's going on in the background. Then what happens? Trump wins. All of those plans become no longer operative. To sort of say, I knew all along, I just was a good team player, but never do this again. Because two things happen at once. One, Trump's in charge. He's hiring all these administration positions. He's most powerful man in the world. That's compelling all in its own right. And then here's the other thing that a lot of people who don't live in kind of red parts of America miss. The emotional bond between him and the GOP voters after he beat Hillary Clinton has to be understood. Because your rank and file Republican walked into that up until president that they had impeached and that they still to this day couldn't believe that no Democrat would vote to convict him. I can't believe it either. After he was caught red-handed, perjury. I mean, if y'all haven't looked up all the stuff Trump did, Clinton did, just look it up. And so this anger and the sense of despair that Hillary was going to be won, and then he beats her. There was this emotional bond that was then formed. And then, even though there was a lot of people said, well, I just voted for him because he's the lesser evil. There's a really interesting part of human nature. We don't like to be on team lesser evil, right? On a day-to-day basis, you don't want to be like, I'm bad. I'm not as bad as that guy. You want to be good. And so the whole kind of Trump movement and persona began to be rebranded as actually the tweets are a good thing. Actually, this is a good thing. Actually, this is a good thing. These are desperate times. They call for desperate measures. And so you begin to see how very natural human process took over.
Right. Thanks so much for coming. Right before I came here, I was talking to a friend of mine who's sort of like populism, and I said, "Oh, I'm going to go to the David French talk." And he goes, "Oh, he's a big neocon."
Okay.
So I like to ask you: do you think that camp of people, traditional conservatives who believe in a more active American presence, do they need to rebrand themselves? If so, how do you think that could be done at this time?
There's only so much control that you have over how people describe you. Spend any time on Twitter and you learn that very quickly. I'm fond of what my friend Jim Garrity has said many times. One of the things about life is that reality always gets a vote and reality wins. And when I think about, like, say, for example, my foreign policy ideas, economic policy ideas, either they sort of play out and they're credible or they're not. And there's a rubber that meets the road. When foreign policy is, A, it's complicated in military policy. B, it's very difficult. C, it's subject to unexpected events. So anybody who walks in and says, I have a theory of the world, and this is how it's going to work, and I've got the answers. No. But there are some realities that do exist in geopolitics. There are some realities that exist in economics. There are some realities that exist across all disciplines. And so the question then becomes not what's my label, but how much do my ideas conform to those realities? And if your ideas do conform to the realities, then regardless of your label, in a time of crisis and emergency, it's entirely probable, possible, maybe probable is a little generous, that people will awaken to that. So there, for a long time, there's a lot of voices crying out in the wilderness saying the Soviet Union is weaker than you think. The Soviet Union has a lot of strategic weaknesses. This late 70s, early 80s narrative of American decline is wrong. And those people happen to be right. And so I'm much less concerned over whether or not somebody calls me neoconservative than I am about whether or not the concept that forward deployed American soldiers in support of strong defensive alliances keeps great power peace. Of that position, I'm pretty convinced that that's correct.
You have the distinctive of your name is the label itself, French's. Are you going to embrace that label?
Being an ism, it's a two-edged sword. I mean, what is,
That was a joke.
yeah.
Thank you very much for speaking to us. That was an amazing discussion. My question for you is if you could just put on your media and messaging hat again, what is the playbook for the more hawkish interventionist wing of Republican, I would also argue the Democrat Party? How do you effectively message to gain back a lot of the base of support to where you can go to kind of a pre-Trump notion of what foreign policy is? I'm a Democrat, I also see it on the left, where I consider myself more of a hawkish Democrat.
Yeah,
And you have also on the left kind of an alliance with the right
yeah.
in this kind of populist messaging of non-interventionism, isolationism. So how do we refit the calculation? Is on social media? Is it re-emphasizing great power conflicts with China? What is the way to kind of recenter to the center?
That's a really good question. You know, one of the core challenges is that as instability rises and as our sort of near peer military and economic competitors emerge against us, one of the real issues that you have to have, and it can appeal to, I think, center-right Republicans, center-right Democrats, is let's just look at the evidence of history. And the evidence of history is, as I just said in like one sentence, is that forward deployed American power in support of defensive military alliances keeps great power peace. Okay. That would be like a one sentence mission statement for sort of like what I would think of as my foreign policy philosophy when it comes to great power issues. So, okay, what are the benefits of great power peace? The benefits of great power peace are almost difficult to list in their totality. You know, human prosperity, human life, you know, the ability through the last almost 80 years of great power peace, we've seen some unprecedented growth or unprecedented decreases in absolute poverty throughout the world. It turns out that when human beings are not fighting each other, they often turn towards economic industry. And so there are just enormous benefits of this formula. And the answer, the question that I would have to a lot of Americans is, why are we risking that? Look, it's expensive. I agree it's expensive. It's hard. I agree that it's hard. But if you look at the benefits of what we have reaped for almost 80 years, and then you begin to see the immediate, like we're looking at a force-on-force encounter between your two European nations that might break out like in an hour, and the unpredictable consequences that can flow from that. Does that feel better to anybody? It doesn't, and it doesn't for a lot of really good reasons. And so I think one of the things that is sort of has always been to me some of the best sales pitch for this large military budget, the extensive NATO alliance or alliances in Asia is it keeps the peace. it saves lives, it stops great power war. And one thing that I worry about is that as the greatest generation, as the World War II veterans are dying every day, is that memory of what great power war looks like is fading. And I think that memory is so important to understanding why you don't go back, why you don't repeat some of the mistakes America made in 1918 and 1919 and 1920 as it pulled way back from Europe. You just don't do that. The consequences are too grave. But without that memory, that's one of the reasons why I got so angry in McMinn County, Tennessee, where they get rid of this Holocaust book called Mouse. It might sound silly, but these are the ways you keep memories alive. And to withdraw that memory because there's like 8 curse words and some mouse nudity, are you kidding me? So anyway, I think that we have taken for granted some benefits that have been won through not just a great cost in World War II, but a great continued cost in our posture since World War II.
Hi, sir. Thank you for coming. I was really interested in your discussion on how the resurgence in this religious right is sort of changing the shape of the Republican Party. Do you see that there's room for people who don't identify as socially conservative in this new GOP?
Who don't identify as socially conservative? Less than at any time in my adult life. It was very interesting. So I think when you're 53 years old, you can start to say things like, in my day, I'm old enough to remember. So I'm old enough to remember when I was in law school, there were two factions. So in my law school, there was maybe 12 Republicans and we're divided 6 versus 6. And the big argument was, is the future of the GOP socially conservative and economically conservative, or is it socially liberal and economic conservative? Now the question is the future of the GOP socially conservative and economic conservative, or socially conservative and economically more liberal? That's the big argument, that social conservatism is sort of seen as the cornerstone that unites everybody, everything else. Everything else is contingent. The social conservatism, and when I say social conservatism, I don't just mean social conservatism along the lines of the classic culture war issues of abortion, religious liberty, gun rights. I think of it more as just culture war writ large. So what do I mean by the difference between culture war writ large? That's cancel culture, mask arguments, vaccine arguments, lockdown arguments. It's sort of cultural questions where the right finds itself pitted against the left. And those often extend way CRT, anti-CRT. And that's the thing that unites the GOP right now more than anything else. And that's the dissent from that is more vicious, is treated more viciously than anything else.
Okay, we have time for the last two, so Peter here and then Daniel and then I need.
Thank you again for coming to speak with us. My question is kind of on with Trump during his time in office was kind of like you said, very isolationist, very skeptical of military alliances, but at the same time was very pro-military and expanding our military. And I was just kind of wondering, what do you see as kind of like remnants of the neocon, because he really kind of bolstered our military, raised the salaries of our military members, and was also skeptical. So it seemed kind of like a contradictory platform.
That's an interesting question, because there was very much a strain there was a strain, not very much of a strain, but there was a strain in the Cold War of what I would call Fortress America isolationism, that essentially said, we're just going to be, we don't need to have 350,000 troops, in Western Europe. We don't need to have tens of thousands of troops in Okinawa and 50,000 in South Korea and all of this. We need to be kind of like a porcupine and come back to the Western Hemisphere. But the Fortress America kind of doctrine, there was a fortress in there. So military strength has sort of always been, and with Trump was also very much a part of populist America. it's more not, is the military strong? It's much more, where is the military? And what is it doing? So that's much more of a question. You're not going to have much of a constituency in the GOP, even an isolationist GOP, for cutting the defense budget. And in fact, you're going to have much more of a constituency for maybe expanding it. But that's only part of the equation. So it's where is it? How is it deployed? What is it doing? That's really where the rubber meets the road.
Great, thank you. I had a question about economic issues, sort of fueling the cultural divide and the negative partisanship that you've been mentioning. Would you say that those were important issues, the economic issues in creating that partisanship? And do you think that maybe some of the solutions might be economic solutions?
I am skeptical of the economic solutions argument to some extent, okay? I do think that there is a coherent argument about hollowing out of manufacturing in the Midwest, that there is a real cost and consequence to that where people have felt it and it has altered their lives. But if you look at the Trump coalition, the support for him and the intensity of the support for him also comes from a lot of areas of the country that, perversely enough, have in many ways benefited from the hollowing out of the Midwest manufacturing. So I come from the South. The South has become a home, thanks to right to work laws, of a lot of non-union car plants, right? I come from a town, Georgetown, Kentucky, where it was a small tobacco farming community when I grew up. And then my senior year in high school, they announced the Toyota plant was coming. And now there's a giant auto plant that any Camry you're going to buy in America right now, made by my high school classmates. And they do a good job too. And so now there's this giant manufacturing facility and a bass boat in their driveway, and intense support for Donald Trump. Intense. So there's intense support for Donald Trump in big chunks of the country that have really benefited from the right to work laws, have a much sort of more robust manufacturing base than they had 20, 30 years ago, maybe, and intense support for Donald Trump in those places that have been hollowed out as well. Why would that be? Because I submit that the unifying factor is far more cultural than economic. It's not that the economic stuff doesn't matter, it does matter. It did motivate some percentage of Trump voters, but it's compared to the cultural stuff that you just asked about, much less of a factor. And you can tell, from right-wing media. Right-wing media is very good at knowing its listeners. Very good at it. What's on right-wing media? You'll have, I don't know, I haven't done the calculations, but I believe something along the lines of 273.6 stories on CRT to every one on manufacturing. And so they understand what motivates the base. So does economics matter to human flourishing? Immensely. Does economics matter to our current partisan polarization? I think not as much as a lot of folks may think.
So as we say in the South here, we've left a lot of chicken on the bone, and we'll get to gnaw on that on your next visit, which will be in a month's time. And then if there's still chicken left, we'll get you in the fall, right? So to finally finish off this piece. But you've certainly whetted our appetite for more, so thank you for that. We're very much appreciated.